Great. Thank you, Paolo. I think we may, some questions may arise as we come along. So we've got 3 ports to taste, a white one, a 10-year-old tawny, and a vintage. Obviously, we are tasting what's in the glass, but I want to encourage you to see these wines as generic examples. We don't all have the same wines, but they are broadly similar in style, and I've looked at the technical analysis, and by and large, they are actually pretty similar. After we taste each one, I'd like to encourage you to share your thoughts, especially with respect to serving occasions and food pairings. Last time we did this, we had some really interesting occasions as well as pairings, actually. So let's start with the white. Between us, we have 4 examples of white port. We have the Ferreira Porto Branco Seco, Porto Quevedo Dry White Port, Vista Alegre Dry White Port, and Requa Porto Branco Dry, which is the one I have. So let's have a look. Now, first up, when you have a look, it's golden. It's not quite tawny in color, but it's heading in that direction. Slightly nutty and floral. There's a little spirit there, but it's not overpowering. Sometimes when you taste fortified wines, maybe you say, "Oh, that's spirity." So I think maybe in terms of being competitive, you need to notice that spirit. But for me, in this case, this is really in balance. Then you start to see those sort of oxidative notes, maybe a bit of golden syrup, light treacle. And I think actually it's interesting because I've had this open for a few minutes now, and it is opening up, and those oxidative notes are coming out. There's a bit more earthiness, maybe a little bit of mushroom, perhaps. Something a little floral, I think I said already. Yeah. Okay, so let's have a taste. Now, on first taste, I would argue it's not as sweet as you might expect. And of course, let's not forget that white port is less sweet than other styles. I mean, we're still talking maybe 60, 70 grams per litre residual sugar, whereas you're more likely to get 95, 100, 110 with the red ports, the darker ports. But it's worth bearing that one in mind. So I guess what's interesting, and we have different ones, is to think about the generic style. The aromatic range is wide, but you can expect to find these sort of caramel, toffee notes, which are mostly about oxidation. You might find citrus, orange, and lemon, maybe some apple and honey. Wood-aged bottlings may well offer notes of almond, vanilla, oregano. So what makes it taste this way? Clearly, we've got white grapes, and okay, it's called white port, so it's not too hard to figure out. But let's just, I think if we're thinking about tasting in a rigorous way, we have to remind ourselves there are white grapes here, and this oxidative aging. Now, what other style could this be like? Why is it not that style? So, could it be tawny? Yes, in theory. This one is more golden than tawny. Some white ports can be more at the tawny end of the spectrum, but I think if it was tawny, you would expect more complexity. Paolo, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, tawnies usually are more complex, more dense, because they come from red grapes and they have the tannins and another structure. So it's exactly as you said. Let's not forget that white ports come from white grapes, and white grapes are usually more subtle and more, I would say, sensible and less in terms of structure and in the mouth, in the palate. They are more smooth. So it's a good way, even if the wine starts to become darker, and that's because of the oxidative aging. And of course, that when we have a 20-year-old white or a 30-year-old white, they will be similar in color to a 20 or a 30-year-old tawny. That's true, and they are more difficult. But in the nose and the aromas and flavors, they will be different. More smooth, more delicate, more flowery, orange peel, or orange flower, and also that range, wide range of variety of flavors that you noted. They also come from white grapes. And it's interesting that you spoke about oregano or this kind of
Herbals.
Herbals, exactly. Because I would say that they are probably not even the dry version of these herbals, but the fresh version. Even if it's thyme or oregano, that usually we are used to in cooking to have them dry, but they are slightly different and more vegetal and more herbal when they are fresh.
Yeah, you mentioned this question of no tannins here, and I think that's really important, because even in the, as I think we'll see with the tawny, the tannins are not necessarily obvious, but I think that is a really critical difference. If you are, you know, I know that you're all here to learn, but there's also this element of competition, and that's, I think that the lack of tannins is really critical if you're stuck, if you're looking for a difference. But what about acidity? Would you say that the darker ports from red grapes have higher acidity or lower, or maybe about the same? Today I'm thinking maybe these whites have slightly higher, but I'm gonna put that one over to you.
It's not easy, that one. I think for tasting purposes, at the end of the day, that you won't feel so much of a difference. I would say technically yes, white grapes, even if they are not picked earlier than, usually they are planted in very higher areas, in granite, and not in schist or in granite. So probably the acidity will be more, you will note more the acidity. But at the end of the day, with the blendings, and if you look for varieties that, for instance, one of the varieties that we have in these blends is Gouveio. Gouveio is Godelho. So if you think about Godelho is intense in the mouth. It has more body. And this will allow also the whites to have a little bit more body. Gouveio is very common in the north of Portugal. Actually, we don't, and there is no tradition of doing it as the Spanish and the guys from Galicia do it, only monovarietal on dry wines, on still wines. But yes, so you also have features from each grape variety. I explained a little bit of the reds a while ago, but the whites have exactly the same profiles. Some from fruit, others for acidity, others for body, others for longevity. And the fact that they are whites and they are planted in higher altitudes will probably allow them to have a more vibrant acidity, I would say. Yes. Although after 10 or 20 years old, they will be more balanced between themselves, whites and reds.
Yeah. Okay. So the other thing I think it's worth mentioning at this point is that maybe in the Douro, people took white port seriously, but I don't think many people took white port seriously outside the Douro. I know the French traditionally have drunk a lot of white port. And was it Ernest Croft once said the first duty of a port is to be red? So, you know, I think we're in a phase now where white port has been taken more seriously. And of course, one of the things that's maybe counts against complexity or quality is the idea of a port tonic. But I have to say, port and tonic is a fantastic drink. So I think it's a really good opportunity. And you can see, you can treat white port as an aperitif without the tonic. It goes with things like smoked ham, almonds, and so on. It'll work with starters, maybe with smoked fish, and also even with main courses with oily fish. I see we've got someone from Trivet on the call today. Isa, your boss, once did an event with me. We were looking at sake tasting, and we were looking at wine alternatives to go with dishes that English people eat. So we didn't have any English. We had things like madras chicken and katsu curry, all kinds of things. And there was a curry that he came up with the idea of Madeira. And I looked at it on paper, thought he was insane, but it worked really well. And I think we've definitely got an overlap here, because here we have wines with a degree of oxidation, with a degree of sweetness about them, but with acidity. And you'd be surprised how well wines like this can work with things like oily fish and quite strong sauces. So that's something worth thinking about. And then even there are some possibilities with the right kind of dessert. So I'd be really interested to hear if anybody's got thoughts or comments about what they might do in terms of an occasional or a pairing with the port in their glass. Anyone want to be brave and say something?
Hi, Peter. I use it very often with foie gras. Works really well, especially not the dry style, but the white with a bit more sweetness on it. Works really well with a foie gras terrine or kind of the brioche. The complexity works really well.
Yeah, I like that. Actually, it's interesting, that the whole notion of sweetness with foie gras. I think when you first come across it, you're not sure, but then of course, Sauterne and things like that work really well. I think that's a really excellent choice, actually, really nice. And I think maybe that the nuttiness and the oxidative character would work as well, really well. Brilliant. Anyone else want to stick an oar in? Paula, you want to?
No, yeah, foie gras is also interesting to the extent that usually, if you think about the classic version of the recipe, you have brioche, and brioche also have some touches of sweetness in the bread, and red fruits. So everything could incline to, as André said, more sweet white, sometimes even the tawny. But yes, because sometimes foie gras, it's not only foie gras. It has other elements on the dish that can help the pairing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Anyone else want to stick an oar in? Okay, let's move on to our tawnies. I think we have three amongst us. We have the Crone 10-year-old, the Offley Old Tawny Porto, and the Quinta della Rosa 10-year-old Tonnelle 12, which is what I have in my glass. They are actually really similar, I think. Now, the first thing when you pour is, I think, I think I'm supposed to know what I'm doing, but it's a really good reminder because I'm struck by the fact that the color is closer to garnet than to tawny, or maybe even brick. In any event, there is still some redness still present, and I think that's really important to remember. So it's a tawny port, but you can see it's come from red grapes. I think that's a good reminder about that. It's richly aromatic, jammy in the best sense. I'm always slightly nervous about describing wines that I like as jammy, because I tend to think of jamminess as meaning sort of baked or overripe, but I don't mean that here. I mean more in the sense of maybe confit or poached red fruits, maybe also some dried fruits, but again, trying to avoid the idea of being raisined explicitly. So I'm slightly sitting on the fence there, but there you go. Maybe some sweet spice, maybe vanilla. I know and typically in the Douro, they won't be using new oak here. In fact, the pipes they use for Tonnelle 12 are definitely old, but there's a kind of warming element to the spice. And then maybe marmalade, membrillo, quince paste. Is a pleasing toffee note. Maybe it reminds me a bit of honeycomb.
Those who have Wiesenkron, there is. I think it's interesting to say that Wiesenkron is now part of the Taylor's family, and the wine is quite still has this fruit hint. So although it's a 10-year-old, it's a very fruity 10-year-old to the extent that, as Peter said it perfectly, we go for the poached fruit, or I would say some figs. So the 10-year-old sometimes, especially aged in Gaia, which is the case, aged here in the city in front of Porto, it still has this marked balance between going into caramel and dry fruits and remaining in a red fruit world where it came from. On those who have the Wiesenkron, we can have this good approach. Whereas those who have La Rosa, which is a wine that was aged in Douro, you can feel more the approach of the dry fruits, already some hazelnut and the vanilla and the spiciness that Peter was saying, some gingerbread, very smooth gingerbread. Because actually, if you age, the range of temperatures here in Porto or in Gaia, which is the county just in front of Porto where the wines are aged, is very smooth. All today is 10 degrees here in Porto when we are all freezing, for you to have an idea. We are not used to, for us, a very cold day is 5 to 10 Celsius, and a very hot day is 30 to 35. Whereas in the Douro, the range of temperatures to age in the Douro are very large. You can have -50 in the winter, and you have 40, 45 in the summer. So you can have an idea what does that affect of the wines in terms of aging. So Wiesenkron may look a little bit younger, and La Rosa may look a little bit older, although they have the same age, just because they were aged in different places within the region, which is a very interesting feature. Okay,
good. Now, in terms of the palate here, for me, there's a smoothness and a sweetness. And when I was tasting before we started, I wrote quite satisfying, and I was looking at my notes. And Quinta da Rosa say it's made in a drier house style without any overpowering sweetness, and they believe that's because of there's a minerality present in this wine which comes from the terroir, and that's quite interesting because the sugar levels are pretty standard. I think it's around about 100. They give a range. It's around about 100, which is pretty typical. But I think that's something that's quite important. It's not, for me, satisfying is if it was just sweet, I think it wouldn't be satisfying. And I think there is some tension there and some backbone. And I mentioned when we were talking the white port about tannin, and here there is a little bit of tannic grip. Again, I think it's quite easy to ignore or to take it for granted, but obviously it's a tawny port. It's made from red grapes, so there will be tannin. There are tannins here, and I think the combination of sweetness and age means the tannins are very rounded and soft. And again, we discussed acidity. There is acidity here, but it seems really, to me, seamlessly integrated, but it's definitely present. And that's one of the challenges of tasting blind is actually remembering to look at all the elements of the structure, everything that's there, and don't take things for granted, because I know it's really easy to do, because I've certainly made mistakes when I've been tasting blind. So looking at the generic style of 10-year-old tawny, obviously it's a tawny color, but don't forget you can get some redness. I mean, looking at it now, actually, as there's less in my glass, it's less obviously got red color and it's more obviously tawny. And maybe that might just be also as it's got a bit of air into it. But don't forget that you can find a little bit of red. Now, clearly, if you've got a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old, you're likely to have lost any redness. It's going to be more authentically tawny. We can expect from the style complex oxidative notes, roasted nuts, toffee, etc. We can expect sweetness, again, slightly sweeter than the white ports in style, but it should be balanced. With age, the color of the wines develops into more tawny, and the bouquet should be dried fruits and wood. And the older the wine, the stronger these aromas will be. Why does it taste like this? Of course, we've got this long aging in wood, 10 years on average. Sometimes you'll have portions that are older, and sometimes you have portions that are younger. Paolo, do you want to talk about, again, I mean, I've sort of hinted at that, but in terms of older tawnies, is it just going to be complexity? That if you're presented with a glass and someone says, is this what kind of style of tawny is this?
Yeah, well, they will start being more complex as they age. So I think to keep it simple, I would say that the dry fruits of the 10-year-old will turn into caramels caramel and sugarish on the 20-year-olds, along with some light coffee. That will turn into dark coffee and some spiciness, some soft spices such as nutmeg on the 30-year-old. And then when it comes to the 40-year-old, we'll have the curries, tobacco leaf approach. But even adding more and more layers of complexity as the wines age. You also said one thing that is very important, 10-year-old or 20-year-old, but let's use the 10, that's what we have in front of us as an example. It's not a mix of wines with 15 years old, half of wine with 15 years old, with half of wine of 5 years old. That's not what makes a 10-year-old. A 10-year-old is a perceived a wine that looks like 10 years. So actually it can be 12, it can be 8. The range is quite large, and there is the freedom of the winemaker to make their own style. So that's why Wiesenkron probably is more fruity, because in the Taylor's family, probably Taylor's is already more nutty, and so they want to create a different style within the range of the house. And La Rosa, because it's aged in the door, it's more caramelly and toffee. So it really depends. We want, when the wines arrive at the IGDP for approval, and all the wines come here for approval as samples before the last blending, we want the wines to be perceived as being 10-year-olds and not to have a mathematical reason for being the age of 10 or 20. So this is really important. And as Peter was asking me, as long as they age, of course, this range of the play, the game that the winemakers and master blenders can do with the wines that they have in stock allows them to create more complexity on the style of the wines as they age to 10, 20, 30, 40. And I can tell you, if you don't know already, we will have a new category called 50 years old. And we will also have a new category pretty soon that is called very old, very, very old, VV. It's for us to be able to use like a XO on cognac. Port will have a VV for the approach of these very special wines that you all know, such as Cyan from Taylor's or Nilbly from Graham's, and all these thousand of pounds wines that will be, that now we're being classified in the AVDP under a more than 40-year-old. They will be classified later on. This is still not official, but I cannot already, not official because not published as a regulation, but is already approved inside the IVDP for a VV, which is a more than 80-year-old wine.
And what about Colheita? Because I'm a big fan of Colheita, but I think as you get older, average ages, I'm not sure that I could say, oh yes, that's Colheita, that's a 40-year-old. I mean, broadly speaking, I don't think an examiner is going to mess around with you, ask you to compare a Colheita and a 40-year-old, but it's tricky to tell them apart, isn't it?
It is. It is. To be honest, a Colheita, it's the best description of a Colheita is a single-year tawny. So a tawny wine aged in wood from only 1 year. And I think where you want to get is, what you want me to answer is regarding if we are able to distinguish a 1990 Colheita from a 30-year-old port. I would say some people argue that it's easy because it's the expression of the year, is rougher in the edges because it doesn't have the balance of the other vintages to balance a wine, and a 30-year-old will be much smoother, much rounder, much complex. I am not completely sure that this is true, to the extent that when a winemaker or a company releases a Colheita, they expect to have a very good wine in order to show to the consumer. So it has to be round and balanced and complex at the same level. So I am not sure that you are, when you have two wines, that you immediately pick a Colheita when compared to a wine with a wine of the same year in average.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a question about serving temperature. If I asked you to serve a 10-year-old tawny cold, would you have to hand over your Portuguese passport?
No,
Is it a crime to serve it cold?
No, to be honest, I think I would enhance that.
I can see Andre looking shocked.
No, I have. I would emphasize that I will be in the revolution with the tawny port in my hands in the front of the march for chilled tawnies. We have to be aware that port is higher in alcohol and sweet. So if you serve it at the room temperature, you will have a soup. That's what you'll have, or a cappuccino almost temperature wine. remember that all of your restaurants, and even at home, especially in the UK and in the north of Europe, our rooms are always quite hot, 22, 23 degrees. So we are all professionals here, and you more than me, because you are working restaurants. Serving a wine at 22 to a client, that would be considered a crime. Even a red wine. 22 is room temperature. You only have the alcohol being released from the matrix of the wine. Any wine in the world, from a Riesling to an Aussie Shiraz. So for port, because of the content of alcohol and the sweetness, we don't want the wine to feel strange, and we want the consumer or the client to go to a second glass. That would be perfect for the bill at the end of the meal. So we should chill the port. All of them, of course, the whites to be treated as white wine, and the town is probably and if you can do that in the restaurants in between temperature, serving at 12 to 14, because it will be enjoyed at 16. And of course, the rubies that we'll speak later on, the LBVs and vintages, they, because of the tannic and the structure, they are allowed to be served at a higher temperature, but not more than 18 degrees in order to be enjoyed at 20, or 16 to be enjoyed at 18. And the wines, of course, will be raising in temperature at the table to the equilibrium of the room temperature. So yes, we have to treat ports very carefully and serve them at lower temperatures.
Yeah. In terms of occasions, I think probably most people aren't going to be drinking 10-year-old Tawny as an aperitif. But again, I think with starters like pâtés and foie gras, it can definitely work. But I think it's towards the end of a meal that most people are going to find it most useful. I think anything with nuts, with walnuts in particular, seems to work. Creme brulee again, maybe picking up on those oxidative toffee notes. Strong cheese. I'm a big fan of Tawny port and cheese. But again, can I ask, anyone got any particular favorite matches that they do?
They're all very quiet.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a very special dinner for some special people. Love sport. I work in a private members club, classic port land, and basically I was challenging to put a full meal for 30 people with port, especially old ports. So I made a 30 years old Kopka white port tawny with a carpaccio, and that was amazing. So it was a venison carpaccio, but mature in the house, and it was quite peaty, the carpaccio, so it worked really well.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Tawny ports and venison and game, they work very well. Of course, it depends on how the protein is cooked, but they work very well. And Andrea pointed a very interesting approach, which is it doesn't have to be only as a dessert pairing. It can go to the middle of everything that has puff pastry, that sometimes has some sweetness inside, even if it's a red meat, which if it's not very cooked, it's sweet. It can work with tawnies also. Yeah, excellent suggestion, and I hope that your clients enjoy it, Andrea.
I think also, you know, the Italians have this concept with certain wines. They talk about vino di meditazione, and yeah. I do think that when you have aged wines with this complexity, maybe that it's a nice thing to finish with. That you don't necessarily have to pair it with anything. Although I think last time someone had talked about pairing with cigars. Which is interesting, but you know, I think we can definitely think about it as just that thing to finish with, and it takes me to that point which I've made before, that we always have this problem talking to people, particularly consumers. They say, "Oh, I can't drink port; it gives me such a headache," and I go, "So what did you drink before you had the port? And, usually people drink port on a big night out or a big night in. And, they have a couple of glasses of champagne or maybe a gin and tonic before dinner, have 2 or 3 glasses of white wine, 2 or 3 glasses of red wine, glass of port, and they blame the port for their hangover. And I think we have to be realistic about this. It is stronger than normal wine, but it's not necessarily the cause of the hangover. So it's an interesting social responsibility. On the one hand, we're keen to encourage our customers to drink more, but we're also obviously conscious of excess consumption. But I just do think it's sad that port gets the blame for causing the hangover, when I really don't think it does. Right.
What's also important here in this forum and for the Master of Port is that, of course, port can be a vino de meditazione, but that's what we are all used to, and we never have the opportunity to meditate around port after we get home and after dinner. And I think that's one thing that the big ship of port got stuck. It was into the after meal drink. That nobody does it anymore. So we have to challenge ourselves sometimes that in restaurants we don't even remember to match port or to pair port with food. So the venison idea is very good. The foie gras, just to surprehend a little bit, changing from sauterne or going to game or even into the cheeses. Not all cheeses are for vintage port. And there are very good cheeses, hard cheeses, very mature cheeses that will go perfectly with a 10 or a 20-year-old. So I think that the question of temperature and really doing a job on challenging the clients in order to show them port or one glass of port in the middle of a pairing, it will go very well for sure.
I think also, thinking about, again, in restaurants, there's always that balance between selling and service. And it seems to me that sometimes you can identify an occasion where maybe you've got a table of 4 people and 2 people are having dessert and 2 people aren't. And I think that's, then you can offer people a glass of something. Say, well, would you like to have something while the others have their dessert? And that, to me, is a really perfect time for something like port. And it's not about being pushy, but it's about seeing that maybe they would like something, but they're not necessarily going to order it unless you suggest it. So I think that's a real opportunity for port. I'm conscious that time is spinning by. So let's look at our third port today. It's a vintage. You'll either have the Grand Cru Porto or the Portal. They're both 1999. So beginning to show a bit of age. Of course, we've got a deep color, as you might expect. I mean, I can't even see through mine. It's ruby red rather than it's definitely not in the first flush of youth, as you'd expect. And when you smell it, in some ways, it's still quite youthful. It's sort of a bit brambly, some sous-bois, some earth. Somehow smells of seeds and stems, but I mean that in a good way. That doesn't necessarily sound great. It's very ripe with dark fruit aromas. I want to say that I can smell some oak, but I know there's no new oak influence. But again, maybe it's just one of those things that does develop, as we saw with the Tawnies, that you can pick up some sort of sweet spice and a bit of vanilla, and you think maybe it's oak, but I'm pretty sure it isn't. Definitely a bit of licorice. Loads of dark fruit, a pleasing sweetness, then a kind of firm tannic dryness kicks in. And again, like the Tawny, there is some good acidity here, actually. And it brings a kind of lift and a freshness to it. I personally think this is fruity and really drinkable, but the backbone means I think it's going to continue to age in the bottle. I think there's no rush to drink this. It's mouth-watering, it's chewy. I'd be really happy to drink this now, but I think it's got plenty of time. I mean, I think this is actually quite a restaurant-friendly style. I know there are all kinds of challenges serving vintage port in restaurants in terms of preserving freshness and so on. I'd love to hear what people think about that, actually. The challenge, you know, how you deal with serving vintage port. When I started out, we didn't have preservation systems. You know, you decant the port and then try and sell it as fast as you could. And there was always the problem that because it was fortified, some people thought that it would live forever once it was open. And of course, we know that's not true. But you definitely can get a little bit more mileage out of an open bottle than you can with a normal red wine. But I was always keen to actually shift it while it was fresh in a few days, because I think you serve the customer much better. Any comments on how you deal with serving vintage port? Do you serve vintage port by the glass?
Someone's just beating me to it, but with a driven cork, it's a great opportunity to bust out the Coravin. Obviously, if we're then filtering it as well. So
I think it's great. So, what do you, in terms of the Coravin, does the sediment present any problems?
Yeah, most definitely. Obviously, if you're inverting the bottle, but I suppose we can get away with it with a little fine mesh filter.
Yeah. And then, so you can get a pretty good life out of it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and probably more so than red equivalents if you're using the Coravin, right? Yeah.
Anyone else? Good. Okay, let's just talk a little bit more maybe about some of these, if you like, the generic ideas about vintage port. Obviously, we're finding more aromatic and fruity styles compared to the older styles. Definitely some black fruit, also red fruit. We're looking for ripeness. You know, as Paolo was saying earlier, it gets pretty warm in the Douro, so we're expecting ripe flavors. Is a big mouthful. It packs a punch, and again, with that extended aging, it starts to smooth out. Why does it taste the way it does? I think first and foremost, it's got to be about vineyard quality. The best sites are where people source the grapes for their vintage ports. They're looking for optimal ripeness, and they're looking for relatively short wood aging. What other styles are like that? Well, broadly speaking, you can include vintage port in the ruby category, but clearly you're not going to compare this to a ruby port as such. But, you know, LBV, it's the same kind of color, extremely full-bodied, rich in the mouth. Paolo, we'd expect more complexity from a vintage compared to an LBV?
No, yeah, for sure. I would say that it all comes from the selection of the grapes at one point. So the winemakers, when they do select grapes for vintage, they select the best grapes, ripeness, acidity, those grapes that they feel that the wine will age, that will be very strong in the beginning, powerful, and that it will age for decades. And I would think then when it comes to LBV, the grapes will be like a second, in the good sense, at second choice, a deuxième cru, if we can make a comparison, because they want the wine to be more ready sooner, so the grapes don't need to be so intense, so tannic, so structured, so powerful. They can be smoother in order for the wine to be ready to be enjoyed before. So yes.
I guess the other one that's going to be harder to spot, certainly as a single bottle, is a single quinta.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be from a top site, but maybe in a non-vintage declared year.
Yeah, sometimes we think that a single quinta, and it was transmitted by some magazines and at an earlier point in history, that a single quinta was a second vintage. But actually for the IVDP, if you have vintage, the word vintage in a label, you have to follow the same process for a classic year and a flagship wine and for a single quinta. So the thing is, what happens is that sometimes or most of the years in the Douro are uneven. They can be very good in one area and it can rain a lot in another one. So actually, when not overall. When the classic year is when the overall of the region was very good in terms of grape production. But actually, in a non-classic year, if I have two estates, one estate can be very good in terms of performance of the grapes and the other not that good. So I will only bottle vintage from one of my estates. And that's the single quinta notion. So it's a wine, a very good wine from a non-classic year. I think that's the best way to put it.
And to be fair, I think in terms of blind tasting, it would be a little unfair to give you a single quinta or a vintage. But I think if you had a pair of them, maybe you'd have a better chance of spotting the difference.
Yeah, well, yeah, to a certain point, but you can have very good vintages from odd years, from not those years that are wines that are behaving very well. Bear in mind that some of the smaller companies now are single quinta wines and they release vintages almost every year, because one year, if the year is very good, they can release 30,000 bottles. In a year that is not that good, they release 5,000 bottles, but they have vintages every year. So it will really depend on the thing that what time we'll do with them. So actually, if you have a single quinta vintage, sometimes you don't distinguish it from a vintage because they are both vintages.
Yeah.
So that unfairness is quite blurred at the end of when the time passes. Yeah, but LBV will always be a wine that is more enjoyable, less tannic, less structure, but still very fruity, very complex in the terms of layers of aromas, and very, very delicate.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of service possibilities, I'm not quite sure I can think of many starters I'd be trying to match vintage port with. But again, coming back to this notion of maybe main courses with red meat and game, particularly with intense sauces, I think that, particularly if you've got maybe a pairing menu, I mean, I think expecting people to buy a bottle of port to go with their main course is probably a bit much. But I think with a pairing menu, it could be really interesting to see that. And then, of course, with desserts, there is the English classic of Stilton and vintage port. I think other cheeses can work really well. And then chocolate-based desserts. Although personally, I almost feel happier putting tawny, aged tawny with chocolate, but that's maybe just a personal choice.
It depends on it depends on how the chocolate is made. If you think, okay, chocolate with vintage or chocolate with a ruby port, but if it's a ganache, if it's a milk chocolate, if it's mixed with dry fruits, of course you will go to a tawny. Because if you have a dark chocolate dessert, which is already harsh, and the chocolate it also has tannins and dries your mouth, it's probably to go to a ruby or an LBP or a vintage. So it really depends on the chocolate, as it depends on the cheese. If it's a blue cheese or a sheep cheese or a chèvre, it will also be probably more suitable for ruby ports. And even on the steaks, if you have a very good steak, dry aged steak, but it really depends on the sauce. Imagine that if you have a mushroom sauce with these earthy aromas, you will probably need a fruity wine and also a very intense wine to match it. If you think about an Aussie Shiraz or even a Côte d'Ivoire more rough Syrah, you cannot probably swipe it and change it to an LBV because you have the earthy aromas and you need something sweet and more balanced to make the pairing. So it really works. Or a green pepper sauce on the steak. So the important then is not the steak, but really what comes along with it. One final note that I think it's very important on vintages is we're talking about a 22-year wine, and the wine is still very fruity and very intense in the mouth. Which other wine you would open with 22 years and will still be performing like this? And I think this is very interesting when we search for a potential of a wine.
I think sometimes the kind of status of vintage port means we sort of treat it as the sort of venerated object.
A relic, yeah, a relic.
And we're a bit scared of it. We're not really sure what to do with it, so we kind of stick with safe options. I think it's a really good point. Time's going on, so and I'm sure people have got a lot to do. So I guess we definitely have time for questions. I'd be really happy to have questions from you guys about anything. I mean, anything sort of factual about what Paolo was talking about before, service issues, challenges, anything at all. We'd be really happy to have questions. The first session, we had some really fantastic questions. So feel free to stick your oar and ask a question. Or if you want to just pontificate and make a statement, that'd be great too. Actually, can I ask a question to Andre? Andre, as a Portuguese native, but working in London for a long time, you have an interesting view on this. Would you say, and you were saying you're working at a members club now, in a way it's sort of absolutely traditional port territory, but if you're prepared to push the boundaries and do different things and show people different things, but would you say that people in the broader world, I mean, in London, whatever, outside of clubs, are open to different styles of port and trying and experimenting? And I'm assuming that you've done that. And what's the secret?
I think, thank you, Peter. I think it's not just port. It's not just port. I think all the fortifieds having a revival, and I think the biggest flag it's what Sherry's been achieving. But the thing is, you see all the trends coming up, you know, the cigars and port dinners happening all over the place, you know, from the most prestigious places to general public to the most restricted. That is one thing. I think people is willing to try more. And I think the knowledge coming to us on the industry is larger now. Say, for example, I'll give you an example. When I came here, the port was service, especially vintage port, was not treated properly. And one of the things I've been teaching the old school, and this is the bigger drinkers of port, it's if you chill your vintage port half an hour just before you serve it, you know, the alcohol disappear and that perception of a very alcoholic drink disappear. And I think the lack of a knowledge is like Madeira being served hot and Tawny Port's being served hot. It's literally, you don't want the drink to show in its best performance. And I think it's all the knowledge around. And I'm still cutting my heart every time I go to a restaurant and I see bottles of Madeira and Tawny Ports and even vintage ports open behind the counter just at the room temperature. And as Paul was mentioning, it's not giving any favor to the drink. I think it's beating the drum of moving forward on the knowledge how to present the drink. You know, no one will grab a Baroli's being open behind the bar and serve it straight away at that temperature. Another thing I think you notice, and one of the things, for example, I had a vintage 2017 that I remember, and I taste the wars and as an example, and I did that vintage port through Christmas as explaining to people that, especially after the early 90s, where the spirit is being changing quality, you can drink younger ports, especially vintage ports, as an LBV style, and it's amazing. You know, I had a tasting of some early vintage ports, and they showing performance well. Some of them are undrinkable, as we know, but other ones they really performance really well. So I think it's not being scared to explain to people and educate people. And I have a massive legend of fans now that they will not drink a vintage port. I can serve vintage port at lunchtime, and people still go to the office and work. But it's how much you drink and how you present it to people. I think is the secret. And I think it's being nailed very well on the trade with a lot of the sommeliers kind of more teaching their juniors, and even a lot of restaurant managers have quite a lot of a knowledge how to present. And I think it's the revival of fortifieds really coming to action and taking that storm.
Great, thank you. Really interesting question from Lucy and Yana. And maybe Joshua, if he's still around, might want to answer this. And the question is, maybe we've lost Joshua, but the question is, how much does the shaking of the bottle during caravan service affect the quality of the pour? I think
here.
you're gonna. Paolo, do you want to have a go?
No, I would say that I need to do more tests regarding Coravan, how probably moving the bottle very smoothly, or because if we're thinking, if I don't know, I really don't know. I would have to do more tests, try to move the bottle as less as possible. I don't know how much the Coravan needle, I would say, go down. It would really have to be tested in order. I think it's a good idea. To be honest, I never thought about it until this forum when you started to talk about Coravan, because we've been seeing it for Burgundy, old Burgundies, and the old Burgundies also have deposits. So, Joshua, I pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not the most ideal method, but as I said before, I think you can pour a pretty decent glass, yeah, through
with a steady hand.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know that I think at 67 they like developed a contraption where they invert the Coravin, or they invert the bottles, and then they kind of leave the Coravin in there. I might be completely wrong with that, but that's what someone was telling me as a way to alleviate sediment.
Let's put Coravan working on that.
Personally,
the port Coravan machine.
From personal experience, half through the bottle is fine. If you have for heavy vintage ports, say very old ports, half through the bottle, the sediments really start taking a kick on the needle. Say, I tried myself with young vintage ports, it's fine, but with old vintage ports, the sediments start getting in the needle and is absolutely a no-go. I have experience with that, and basically to pour a glass, you clean 3 times the needle, so it's out of question. With the very old vintages, that is my personal experience. Even using the thicker needles doesn't work. The sediment kicks in.
I mean,
that's my experience.
Maybe one solution might be to actually decant it and then give it a. Someone just gave me one of these the other day to try, but it's in a gas that you put on top. So maybe one solution might. With a lot of sediment, is to just decant the whole thing, and then give it a blast with an inert gas. It's not perfect, but it is probably going to gain you a bit of mileage.
Michele was going to say something. No.
Yes, I do. That's what I want to say. So I use a lot Coravan for port. We do run 85 vintage. As I said, when you go less than half bottle, that's what I do. Decant all the rest. And I have that kind of, I buy some argon gas that I put inside, I recork the bottle and new fresh cork. But mostly I save a bottle every 2 weeks max, so still kind of freshness. So that's the key. I think Coravan, it's help a lot, at the beginning. And about having sediment, I think sometimes, kind of give a little bit more character to the port itself. Because if the bottle stays stand, you have all the sediment at the bottom. So that's kind of has a different taste, the wine on the end, that the wine is on the top. So that's quite things to think about too.
I mean, I think it raises the question for all of us that when whatever system you use, and it doesn't have to be a sport, I think no system is perfect and no system is magic. And at the end of the day, you've still got to sell. Once you've opened a bottle, you've really got to, you do have to make an effort to shift the glasses. And that's the best way of having a more or less consistent serve.
There are 2 more questions on the chat from the Fat Duck Sons. What do I think about the beneficio system? I think it's not what I think, but what does he work for? And from a certain point of view, the beneficio works linked with the pointing system of the estates, from the point system of the estates. The beneficio is used to redistribute the production of port throughout all producers and benefiting those who have a better condition for grape growing, from the letters A to F. From one point of view, it has this advantage of redistributing the richness. It's, of course, it has a social value in the beginning because it redistributes the production of port and it benefits those who raise better grapes. And on the other hand, nowadays, it also allowed us another thing is to have the also very good grape selection, the top grape selection for Douro wines, because an estate cannot produce completely only for ports, which allows that A-grade grapes to be also available for still wines, which, although it's a byproduct, but it works very well in terms of keeping quality also on still wines, which is very good for us as a region. Giuseppe also asked, where do we buy spirits to fortify port? The spirits have to be approved in the IVDP. They don't come from inside the region, so they can come from anywhere. Nowadays, they mostly come from south of Portugal, near Lisbon, in the Cartaxo region, or the west region. From Spain, that you know, in the region of Castilla-La Mancha, with the Iren grape, they produced a lot of spirits, or used to produce a lot of spirits when they were funded by the European Union. Iren, as you know, is Uni Blanc, the same grape as Cognac, and France. So I would say, and I think there is one Italian, but mostly Portugal, Spain, and France are the main suppliers of spirits. They have to be previously approved at the IVDP before the companies do business between themselves, because as they have to be approved here, they lower the risk approving the grape spirit before selling it to the houses, to the port houses. So all spirits are approved here, and we are also registered for distillers here in the IVDP. And I think we have to close. I don't know, it's 20 past, so I don't know if there is one more question, I don't know. It's a good question. If the spirit used, what time or which spirit is preferred? I have to be honest with you. We want the spirit as neutral as possible. But of course, there are already studies being made for instance, spirits for townies and spirits for rubies. We know that superior alcohols, or some superior alcohols, this is more chemistry, sorry, but some superior alcohols are more able to retain color, which probably would suit better vintage ports. So there are people that are already making studies and buying spirits that have different characteristics, more from the chemical side than from the tasting side. Because at the end of the day, only neutral with no color, no smell. Of course, they also have a little hint of vegetable because they are distilled from wine or distilled from stems. Of course, they will have some, but at the end of the day, they will not influence the wine or the must to a point that they will transform the wine and transform the flavors of port.
Thank you for that. I think that's probably enough, unless anyone's got another burning question. Can I say thank you to you all for attending? I hope you're all going to enter the competition. And if you do, good luck with that. But I think that's enough from us for now. So good health to all of you. Have a productive and fun week. I hope you're all fully staffed and not having to work too many extra shifts. I can see some grim smiles there. Okay, and that's it from us. Thanks very much, Paolo. Thanks to Annie and Susie for organising, and we'll see you all soon. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.